Elliot Grayson's penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, perched high above the city's restless heartbeat, but its sterile luxury only deepened the ache in his chest, a void no amount of wealth could fill. At 42, he'd built a tech empire, his cybersecurity software guarding the secrets of Fortune 500 companies. Yet his own life felt like a locked vault, cold, inaccessible, and devoid of meaning. His mornings began with espresso from a machine that cost more than a used car. His evenings ended with whiskey in a silent apartment, and the hours between were filled with meetings where flattery masked ambition. Last week, his sister Clara's voice had cut through the haze during a rare phone call, her words sharp and unyielding. "You're not living, Elliot, you're just existing in a gilded cage." Her accusation lingered, stirring memories of their childhood, when they'd shared dreams of adventure under a suburban sky, before success had driven a wedge between them. Restless, Elliot scrolled through news on his tablet, pausing at a grainy photo of the Hollow, a hidden encampment beneath the city's oldest bridge, where people lived in tents and shadows, their lives stripped to the essentials. The article spoke of their resilience, their unseen struggles, and something in Elliot snapped a longing to feel something real, to trade his curated existence for a glimpse of raw humanity. He decided to become one of them, not as a philanthropist, throwing money at a problem, but as Eli, a man with no past, living among the homeless for 30 days to capture their stories in a journal. The preparation was meticulous. He let his beard grow coarse, swapped his tailored suits for a thrift store jacket with frayed cuffs, and chose boots that rubbed his heels raw, a deliberate discomfort, to anchor him to this new reality. His penthouse, with its sleek furniture and abstract art, felt like a stranger's home as he packed a backpack, bread, a water bottle, a thin blanket, and the leather-bound journal that would hold his truth. In the mirror, Eli stared back, his eyes haunted but alive, the polished millionaire buried beneath a disguise that felt oddly liberating. Leaving his apartment, the city's noise hit him like a wave horns blaring, voices overlapping, the scent of street food mingling with exhaust. He walked miles to the bridge, each step shedding the weight of his old life, though doubt gnawed at him. Could he survive without his wealth, his connections, his safety net? At the Hollow's edge, the bridge loomed like a stone giant, its underbelly damp and shadowed, alive with the flicker of campfires and the murmur of voices. The air carried the tang of river mud and smoke, and Eli's heart raced, not with fear but with a strange exhilaration, as if he were stepping off a cliff into a world that could break or remake him. He gripped his journal, its blank pages a promise and a challenge, and took his first step down the concrete slope, the city's pulse fading above as he entered a place where survival was the only currency. Eli descended into the Hollow, the bridge's shadows swallowing the city's glow as the world transformed into a gritty tapestry of survival and resilience. The ground beneath his thrift store boots was uneven, littered with cracked concrete and patches of dirt, and the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth, charred wood, and something faintly sour, like unwashed clothes left too long in the rain. Makeshift shelters lined the riverbank, tents patched with duct tape, tarps strung between rusted pipes, and cardboard lean-tos that swayed in the evening breeze. The hum of traffic overhead blended with the crackle of a nearby fire, where a handful of figures huddled, their faces etched with weariness but alive with quiet defiance. Eli's pulse quickened, not from fear but from the rawness of it all, a stark contrast to the polished sterility of his penthouse. He clutched his journal, its weight grounding him, but his hands trembled. He was an outsider here, a fraud in tattered clothes, and the thought of being exposed tightened his chest. As he wandered deeper, eyes followed him, some curious, others wary, like predators sizing up a stray. A man with a matted beard muttered under his breath, brushing past Eli with a shoulder that felt like a warning. Eli's city instinct screamed to turn back, but he pressed on, drawn to the fire's glow where a woman's voice, firm yet warm, carried over the murmurs. She was in her 50s, her hair streaked with grey and tied back with a frayed scarf, her hands gesturing with authority as she divided a loaf of bread among the group. This was Maria, he'd later learn, the unspoken leader of the Hollow, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos. Eli lingered at the edge of the circle, unsure how to approach, until Maria's eyes met his, sharp and searching, as if peeling back his disguise. "You lost, or you looking for something?" she asked, her tone neither kind nor cruel, just direct. Eli stammered, his rehearsed storyline, no last name. Down on his luck, feeling flimsy under her gaze, but she nodded, pointing to a spot by the fire. Sit. Nobody starves here if you can help it. He sat, the warmth of the flames a small comfort, against the chill seeping through his thin jacket, and accepted a piece of bread, its crust hard but tasting of generosity he hadn't earned. The group around the fire was a patchwork of lives. Sam, a wiry teenager with a chipped front tooth and a guarded smirk, who eyed Eli like a puzzle to be solved. Old Joe, a lanky man with deep-set eyes and fingers stained from years of wrench turning, who hummed softly to himself, and others whose names Eli didn't yet know, their faces telling stories of loss and endurance. Conversation was sparse, but when it flowed, it carried White Sam's sharp quips about dodging cops, Maria's quiet mention of a shelter that turned her away, Old Joe's tale of a car he'd once rebuilt from scrap. Eli listened, his journal unopened in his lap, afraid to write for fear of seeming out of place. Then trouble came. A younger man, wiry and agitated, demanded Eli's backpack, accusing him of hiding something valuable. Eli froze, his lack of street smarts betraying him as he fumbled for words. The situation escalating until Maria stepped in, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "He's new, Tommy. Back off." The man retreated, but not before spitting at Eli's feet, leaving him shaken and humiliated, his disguise feeling thinner than ever. Maria handed him a chipped mug of watery coffee, her eyes softening just enough to notice. "Takes time to find your place here," she said, and Eli nodded, guilt pooling in his stomach. He was here to learn, to feel, but already he'd brought suspicion. As the fire died down, the group dispersed to their shelters, and Maria offered Eli a corner under a tarp, a small act of trust he didn't deserve. Alone in the dark, the river's murmur his only companion, Eli opened his journal and wrote his first entry. "They share what little they have, not because they must, but because they choose to. I've never felt so small." The words poured out, raw and unsteady, capturing the flicker of connection he'd felt by the fire, the shame of his deception, and the unexpected warmth of Maria's gesture. The hollow was no longer just a place, it was a living, breathing world, and Eli was both intruder and student, teetering on the edge of something profound. The hollow woke with the dawn's grey light filtering through the bridge's iron lattice, casting jagged shadows over the patchwork of shelters where Eli had spent a restless night on the cold ground. His thin blanket, no match for the river's damp chill. His body ached, unused to sleeping without a mattress, but the discomfort sharpened his senses, making every sound the rustle of a tarp, the distant clatter of a shopping cart, the soft cough of someone nearby feel vivid and urgent. He rose, rubbing his stiff shoulders, and found the hollow alive with quiet purpose. Maria was boiling water over a small fire. Sam was sorting through a bag of scavenged cans, and Old Joe was tinkering with a broken radio, humming a tune that felt older than the bridge itself. Eli, still reeling from last night's confrontation, kept his head down, determined to prove he belonged, even if his presence felt like a lie. Maria tossed him a glance, not unkind, and handed him a dented tin cup filled with weak tea, its warmth seeping into his palms as she nodded toward a pile of torn tarps. "Help Joe fix those. New guy," she said, her voice a mix of command and invitation. Eli joined Old Joe, whose calloused hands moved with a mechanic's precision, stitching the tarps with a needle and fishing line, his stories flowing as easy as his stitchy stalies of a garage he'd once owned, of cars he'd brought back to life, of a family that had faded away when the money ran dry. Eli listened, his journal tucked away, feeling the weight of Joe's loss but also the man's quiet pride in surviving. Sam, nearby, was less open, his sharp eyes darting to Eli as he worked. Still stung by the newcomer's awkwardness during the robbery attempt, eager to contribute, Eli offered to join Sam on a scavenging run, and after a reluctant nod, they ventured into the city's fringes, weaving through alleys where the air smelled of grease and garbage. Sam moved like a fox, quick and cautious, teaching Eli how to spot discarded food in diner bins or usable clothes in donation piles, all while dodging security guards and curious stares. In a rare moment of candor, Sam muttered about his old life, a foster home where fists spoke louder than words, and Eli felt a pang, recognizing the same loneliness he'd buried beneath his wealth. Back at the hollow, the day unfolded into a rhythm of shared survival. Eli helped Maria distribute a donation of die-old bread, marveling at how she stretched every crumb to feed the group, her hands steady despite the lines of exhaustion on her face. That evening, Maria announced a story night, a tradition where the Hollow's residents gathered to share pieces of their past, and Eli sat among them, his heart racing as the firelight danced on their faces. Old Joe spoke first, his voice low and steady, recounting a winter he'd spent sleeping in his broken-down truck, warmed only by the memory of his daughter's laugh. Maria followed, her story halting but raw, a nurse who'd lost everything to medical debt after a cancer scare, now nursing the Hollow's sick with whatever supplies she could scrounge. Sam, to Eli's surprise, joined in, his voice barely above a whisper as he described writing poetry on napkins to escape the chaos of his childhood, dreams he'd tucked away to survive the streets. Each story was a thread in the Hollow's tapestry, woven with pain but also resilience, and Eli felt his own life, its boardrooms, its bank accounts, shrink in comparison. He wanted to write it all down, to capture their strength, but his pen stayed still, the act feeling intrusive, almost disrespectful. Instead, he shared a small truth of his own, not his wealth, but a memory of building forts with Clara as kids, a time when he'd felt truly alive. The group listened, and Sam's guarded smirk softened, just for a moment, into something like trust. As the night ended, Eli lay under his tarp, the river's murmur blending with the echoes of their stories, and opened his journal to write. They carry their scars like badges, not burdens. I came to learn from them, but I'm the one being taught. The words felt inadequate, unable to capture the warmth of Maria's leadership, Sam's hidden dreams, or Joe's quiet dignity. Guilt gnawed at him as wealth could buy them food, shelter, a way out, but revealing it might shatter the fragile bond he'd begun to form. The Hollow was no longer just a place to observe. It was a community he was starting to need, and the thought of losing it terrified him more than the cold or the hunger. Eli's days in the Hollow had woven him into its fabric, each shared meal and story stitching him closer to Maria, Sam, and old Joe. Yet the weight of his secret grew heavier, like a stone in his chest, threatening to unravel everything. The morning sun barely pierced the bridge's shadow, casting a dim glow over the camp where residents moved with quiet urgency, their murmurs tinged with unease. Word had spread of a city ordinance to clear the Hollow, a plan to sweep away the tents and tarps in favor of a new development, leaving its people with nowhere to go. Maria stood at the center of the camp, her scarf loose around her shoulders, rallying a small group with a voice steady but strained, outlining a protest to confront the city workers when they arrived. Eli watched from the sidelines, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, his mind racing with possibilities. His wealth could unlock legal aid, temporary housing, a voice loud enough to be heard, but the truth of his identity felt like a betrayal waiting to happen. He helped Sam reinforce a sagging shelter, their hands brushing as they tied knots, and Sam's usual sharp quips were muted, his eyes distant with worry about where he'd go if the Hollow was gone. Eli wanted to promise safety, to confess he could help, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the fear of being seen as a fraud. Instead, he threw himself into the camp's efforts, hauling water from a nearby spigot and listening as old Joe recounted a time he'd faced eviction from his old apartment, his voice soft but resolute, saying, "They can take your place, but not your fight." The words struck Eli, a reminder of the resilience he'd come to admire, but also a mirror to his own cowardice hiding behind Eli while Elliot Grayson's resources could make a difference. That afternoon, as the camp prepared signs for the protest, Eli's journal became his refuge, its pages filling with fragments of the Hollow's spirit, Maria's quiet strength, Sam's guarded hope, Joe's enduring kindness. But the journal became his undoing when Sam, tasked with moving Eli's backpack, noticed it open and glimpsed a page with the words "Millionaire" and "Experiment" scrawled in a moment of reckless honesty. The air turned electric as Sam's face hardened, his voice low and cutting as he confronted Eli in front of the fire. "You're not one of us, are you? This is just a game to you." The accusation drew eyes, and the camp's fragile trust cracked. Maria's gaze was a mix of hurt and disappointment. Old Joe's silence heavier than words. Eli stammered, his carefully crafted alias crumbling, and admitted he'd come to learn, to understand, but the truth sounded hollow, like a rich man's whim dressed up as empathy. Sam tossed the journal at Eli's feet, its pages fluttering, open, and stormed off, leaving the camp in a tense hush. Maria approached, her voice calm but piercing. "You wanted our stories, Eli, but you didn't trust us with yours. Go back to your world, we don't need your pity." The words cut deeper than the cold, and Eli gathered his things, the eyes of the hollow burning into him as he climbed the slope back to the city, each step heavier than the last. In his penthouse, the silence was deafening, the marble counters and designer furniture mocking his failure. He sat on the floor, journal open, rereading the stories he'd collected: Maria's sacrifice, Sam's dreams, Joe's resilience, and saw not just their strength, but his own arrogance, thinking he could walk in their shoes without consequence. The city skyline glittered beyond his window, a reminder of the power he wielded. Yet he'd never felt so powerless, so small. He thought of Clara's words, calling him detached, and realized she was right. He'd treated the hollow like a stage, its people like characters in his redemption arc. Tears blurred the ink on the page as he wrote, "I came to find real life, but I broke their trust instead." The weight of his deception was unbearable, but the stories he'd heard refused to let him go, their voices echoing in his mind, demanding he do something, anything, to make it right. He stared at his phone. It screened a gateway to the wealth he'd hidden, and wondered if he could help without further betraying the people who'd shown him what it meant to truly live. The hollow's fate hung in the balance, and so did Eli's chance at redemption. Eli sat on the cold marble floor of his penthouse, the city's skyline a glittering mockery of the life he'd fled. His journals splayed open beside him, its pages a testament to the trust he'd shattered in the hollow. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator, a stark contrast to the river's murmur and the crackle of campfires that had lulled him to sleep under the bridge. Sam's anger, Maria's disappointment, and old Joe's quiet withdrawal replayed in his mind, each memory a sharp reminder of his failure, not just to blend in, but to honor the humanity of those who'd welcomed him. He'd come to the hollow, seeking real life, but all he'd done was play a part, his wealth a secret that tainted every connection he'd made. Yet the stories he'd heard, Maria's selflessness, Sam's hidden dreams, Joe's enduring hope, refused to let him sink into despair. They were a call to action, a challenge to be more than a bystander in their struggle. Eli picked up his phone, its sleek screen a portal to the power he'd hidden, and dialed his lawyer friend Rachel, a sharp-minded advocate who'd once helped him navigate corporate battles. He spoke carefully, avoiding details of his deception, and asked her to investigate the city's ordinance to clear the hollow, to find any legal loophole that could delay or stop the eviction. Rachel's voice was skeptical but intrigued, promising to dig into permits and zoning laws, and Eli felt a flicker of purpose, a chance to act without exploiting his disguise. Next, he contacted a local shelter he'd once dismissed as a tax write-off, arranging an anonymous donation to secure beds and meals for the hollow's residents if the worst came to pass. The act felt small, inadequate against the scale of their need, but it was a start, a way to honor the community without forcing his way back into it. Days later, Eli returned to the hollow, not as a resident but as a volunteer, his backpack swapped for a crate of donated blankets, his heart pounding with the fear of rejection. The camp was quieter now, the threat of eviction hanging like a storm cloud, and Maria was at the fire, her face etched with exhaustion as she organized a meager meal. She stiffened at his approach, her eyes narrowing, but Eli spoke first, his voice low and earnest. "I'm sorry, Maria. I came here to learn, but I hurt you instead. I want to help, not as a savior, but as someone who cares." He offered no excuses, only the blankets and his presence, and Maria studied him, her silence heavy before she nodded, accepting the supplies with a cautious, "We'll see." Sam, lingering nearby, kept his distance, his arms crossed, his gaze a mix of hurt and curiosity. Eli didn't push, instead joining old Joe to repair a leaking tent, the older man's steady hands and soft humming a small comfort. Joe spoke of the protest they'd planned, a stand to show the city they wouldn't vanish quietly, and Eli listened, his journal untouched, knowing his role now was to act, not observe. Behind the scenes, Rachel's work bore fruit. The ordinance was stalled by a technicality in the city's permit process, buying the hollow weeks, maybe months. Eli funneled more funds anonymously, ensuring food deliveries and medical supplies reached the camp, but he kept his distance from credit, letting Maria distribute the resources as if they'd come from nowhere. Slowly, the camp's mood shifted, hope flickering in small ways. A child laughed as she ate a warm meal. Sam scribbled in a notebook, his pen moving with purpose. Eli's guilt didn't vanish, but it fueled him, driving him to contact a non-profit focused on affordable housing. He pitched an idea for a charity, Hollow Hope, to provide sustainable homes and job training, drawing on his tech connections to fund it without revealing his past to the Hollow. One evening, as the camp shared a rare hot meal from a donation, Maria sat beside Eli, her voice soft but firm. "You didn't have to come back. You know, most wouldn't." Eli met her eyes, his throat tight. "I had to. He showed me what matters." She didn't smile, but her nod was enough. A bridge rebuilt, however fragile. Sam remained wary, but when Eli offered to read one of his poems, the boy hesitated, then handed over a crumpled page, a small gesture of trust. Old Joe, watching from across the fire, raised his tin cup in a quiet toast, his eyes crinkling with warmth. Eli wrote in his journal that night, not about himself, but about them. "They don't just survive, they build, they share, they hope. I'm not their hero, but I can be their ally." The Hollow had changed him, not because he'd found real life, but because it had shown him how to live for others. The Hollow hummed with a fragile hope as the city's eviction plans faltered. The legal delay Eli had quietly orchestrated through Rachel, giving the community a reprieve, like a breath held against the inevitable. Under the bridge, the air was crisp with autumn's edge, the river's surface glinting under the morning light, and the camp's residents moved with a renewed sense of purpose. Tents were patched, a small garden of scavenged pots sprouted herbs, and Maria's steady presence kept spirits high. Eli, no longer a resident but a regular volunteer, arrived with a crate of canned goods, his presence now a familiar thread in the Hollow's daily rhythm. His tech empire, once his entire world, felt distant as he spent hours hauling supplies, or sitting with old Joe, who shared stories of rebuilding engines while teaching Eli to mend a torn sleeping bag. Maria, though still guarded, had softened, her rare smiles a quiet acknowledgement of Eli's persistence, while Sam's trust grew in small gestures, a shared joke, a nod when Eli passed him a broom. Hollow Hope, Eli's charity, was taking shape behind the scenes, its framework built on late-night calls with non-profit leaders and discreet donations that funded blueprints for affordable housing. Yet Eli kept his wealth hidden, letting the camp believe the resources came from a faceless benefactor, fearing his truth would reopen old wounds. One afternoon, as he helped Maria sort donated clothes, she spoke of her past as a nurse, her voice steady but laced with loss, and Eli felt the urge to confess, to tell her he could do more, but he held back, choosing instead to listen, to let her story fill the space between them. That evening, the camp gathered for a meal, a rare feast of hot soup and fresh bread from a local church, and old Joe stood, his voice carrying over the fire's crackle, to thank the unseen donors who'd given them this moment. His eyes landed on Eli, not with suspicion but with warmth, and he said, "Some folks don't just pass through, they stay, and that's what keeps us going." The words hit Eli like a wave, his throat tightening as he realized the Hollow had become his anchor, not just a place to learn but a home he hadn't known he needed. Later, Sam approached, clutching a notebook, and shyly offered a poem about a boy who found family in the shadows, its lines raw and piercing, mirroring Eli's own journey. He read it aloud, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes, and Sam's hesitant grin was a gift, a bridge mended. Eli's work with Hollow Hope gained momentum. The charity secured a grant to fund a small housing project, and Rachel's legal team extended the eviction delay, giving the camp time to relocate some residents to shelters with dignity. Eli met with his sister, Clara, in a quiet cafe, the first time since their argument, and told her about the Hollow, not as a confession of his wealth, but as a story of people who'd changed him. Clara listened, her eyes softening, and said, "You're finally living, Elliot." Her use of his real name, a quiet acceptance of the man he was becoming. Back at the Hollow, Eli joined a community meeting where Maria outlined plans to move to a new site, her voice fierce with determination, and Eli pledged to help, not with money but with his hands, his time. As winter loomed, Hollow Hope's first projector row of modest apartments began construction, and Eli worked with Sam to enroll him in a writing program. the boy's eyes lighting up at the chance to chase his dream. The camp's final night under the bridge was bittersweet. A gathering around the fire where stories flowed like the river nearby. Maria spoke of hope, Joe of resilience, and Sam, emboldened, read another poem, his voice strong. Eli sat among them, no longer an outsider, his journal filled not with observations but with gratitude for the people who'd shown him what it meant to belong. He wrote one last entry: "Real life isn't in wealth or status, it's in the hands that share, the voices that rise, the hearts that endure." As the fire died down, Maria handed him a tin cup, her smile unguarded, and said, "You're one of us now, Eli." The words were a homecoming, a truth he'd carry as he stepped away from his tech empire to focus on Hollow Hope, its mission now, his purpose. The Hollow's residents scattered to new beginnings, some to shelters, others to the new apartments, but their bond remained, a family forged in survival. Eli stood at the bridge's edge one last time, the city's lights above, no longer a cage but a horizon of possibility, knowing he'd found real life, not by pretending but by listening, by staying, by caring.